In 1919, in a conference room in Paris, one economist stood up and told the most powerful men in the world they were about to destroy the peace they thought they were building. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a 36-year-old British Treasury official named John Maynard Keynes, and he'd just read the terms being forced on a defeated Germany. He walked out of that conference. He wrote a book laying out, in plain numbers, exactly what those terms would do. Within a generation, he said, this treaty will destabilize Germany completely. Nobody in that room changed a single clause. 20 years later, almost to the year, his prediction came true in a way that cost the world an estimated 70 to 85 million lives. This is the story of how a warning nobody wanted to hear turned into the deadliest conflict in human history, and the men who had every reason to see it coming and looked away anyway. To understand why Keynes was so certain, you have to understand what Europe looked like in 1918. The First World War had just ended, and ended is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Somewhere around 17 million lives had been lost. Entire generations of young men from France, Britain, Germany, and Russia were simply gone. There were villages in England where every man between 18 and 30 never came home. France had lost roughly 1 in 4 of its military-age men, not wounded. Gone. So when the victors sat down to write the peace treaty, they weren't in a forgiving mood. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of territory, its military, its colonies, and forced it to formally accept blame for the entire war. Then it handed Germany a reparations bill so enormous that Keynes calculated on paper that it was mathematically impossible to pay. He said so, out loud, in that room. Nobody listened. He resigned from the delegation in protest and published his warning to the world instead. The 1920s in Germany played out almost exactly like an experiment in what happens when a country cannot pay a debt it was never able to pay in the first place. Hyperinflation hit so severe that workers were paid twice a day just so they could spend their wages before the money lost value by evening. A middle class that had done everything right, worked hard, saved, stayed respectable, watched their entire life savings dissolve into worthless paper within months. Then the Great Depression landed on top of that. 6 million Germans out of work. Bread lines stretching down city blocks. Into that vacuum stepped a voice that was loud, certain, and had someone to blame for all of it. Adolf Hitler had been a failed artist and an unremarkable corporal in the First World War, a man whose first attempt at seizing power ended in a failed coup and a short prison sentence. But that prison sentence gave him time to write a book. The book gave him a movement. The Depression gave that movement millions of desperate people with nowhere else to turn. In 4 years, his party went from a fringe embarrassment to the largest political force in Germany. The German establishment thought they could manage him, bring him into government, hand him a title, contain him from the inside. He'll calm down, they told each other, once he has real responsibility to answer to. In January 1933, he was made Chancellor of Germany. He did not calm down. Here is the part that gets flattened in how we remember what happened next. The men now responsible for stopping him were not fools, and they were not cowards. They were men who had personally lived through the First War, who had fought in it, buried friends because of it, signed the letters that told mothers their sons weren't coming home. They were terrified of doing that again, and that terror became its own kind of logic. Neville Chamberlain became British Prime Minister in 1937, 68 years old. A businessman by temperament, methodical, someone who genuinely believed most problems could be reasoned through if you sat at a table long enough. He looked at Hitler and saw a man with specific, addressable grievances. Give him back what was legitimately his, the thinking went, and the demands would stop. He called this strategy appeasement. Not as an insult, but as a deliberate policy. Remove the grievance. Remove the fuel. In March of 1938, Germany annexed Austria without a shot fired. Chamberlain watched and didn't act. 3 months after that, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically a border region called the Sudetenland, home to 3 million ethnic Germans. The Czechs had a real, modern army, real fortifications, and a treaty with France that legally obligated the French to defend them if attacked. They were prepared to fight. Instead, Chamberlain flew to Munich, sat across from Hitler for 13 hours, and agreed to hand over the Sudetenland. Without consulting the Czechs, without inviting them to the negotiating table at all. They were simply informed of the arrangement afterward and told they could accept it or face Germany completely alone. They accepted it. Chamberlain flew home, stepped off the plane, and held up a signed piece of paper to a cheering crowd of thousands. Peace for our time, he called it. He was hailed as the man who had just saved Europe from another war. 6 months later, in March 1939, Germany took the rest of Czechoslovakia, not just the German-speaking region this time, all of it. Chamberlain, by his own account, was genuinely blindsided. He stood up in Parliament and announced Britain would now guarantee the independence of Poland, the obvious next country on the list. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, using a staged pretext and a force of 1.5 million soldiers. Because Britain and France had publicly guaranteed Poland's safety, they were now bound to act. 2 days later, both countries declared war on Germany. What followed moved faster than almost anyone expected, because Germany had spent 6 years secretly rearming in open defiance of the Versailles Treaty. The same treaty Keynes had warned would produce exactly this outcome. 100,000 soldiers had become 3 million. A banned air force had been quietly rebuilt from scratch. And they had developed a style of warfare nobody else had fully seen yet. Fast, concentrated, coordinated strikes of armor and air power moving as a single unit. In May 1940, that machine turned toward France, bypassing the heavily fortified border by driving armored columns straight through a forested region French commanders had declared impassable to tanks. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and the country that had held an entire front line for 4 straight years in the First War was gone. Britain now stood alone. Chamberlain resigned. Churchill took his place, and his first speech to Parliament offered the country nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Germany turned east in June 1941, launching an invasion of the Soviet Union with 3 million soldiers across a front nearly 1,800 miles wide, the largest land invasion in human history. Stalin had been warned repeatedly, by his own intelligence services and by outside sources, and dismissed every one of those warnings. The early advance looked unstoppable, but the Soviet Union consumed armies whole in a way France never could. Winter arrived. Supply lines stretched thin. At Stalingrad, over the winter of 1942 into 1943, an entire German army of 300,000 men was surrounded, worn down through months of brutal fighting, and forced to surrender. The momentum of the war shifted permanently in that single battle. Meanwhile, in December 1941, Japan's attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor pulled the United States, which had been supplying Britain from a careful distance, directly into the fight. Germany was now facing a two-front war against a coalition that could outproduce it in every category that mattered. It took nearly 4 more years of fighting across North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and back into continental Europe from both directions before it ended. There was no negotiated peace, no signed agreement at a quiet resort table. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The final toll is still debated, which is its own kind of statement, somewhere between 70 and 85 million lives lost. Roughly 3 to 4% of the entire human population at the time, gone in 6 years. The Soviet Union alone is estimated to have lost 27 million people. Chamberlain died in November 1940 of lung cancer, only 6 months after leaving office. He never lived to see how the policy he had staked his entire legacy on would ultimately be judged. Churchill, the man who replaced him, was voted out of office in July 1945, before the war in the Pacific had even formally ended. An exhausted, war-broken public simply chose someone else, and the piece of paper Chamberlain once held up on that airport tarmac, the one that read "Peace for Our Time," carried Hitler's signature on it, right alongside his own. As for Keynes, the man who saw this whole chain of events coming 20 years before it happened, he lived to watch it play out exactly as he'd predicted, then spent his final years helping design the post-war financial system specifically so the economic conditions that produced this kind of collapse could never form the same way again. He died in April 1946, 10 months after the war ended. By every account, he never once said, "I told you so." There wasn't much point in saying it by then. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many warnings like his are being ignored right now in rooms we'll only understand the significance of 20 years from today? If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe. There's a lot more of it we haven't erased yet.